organizers, and in particular Jose Marengo, for the invitation to be here. And I will also like to acknowledge the efforts that the conference committee made to make sure that there's not only gender balance amongst the panelists and keynote speakers, but also a great geographic north-south and intergenerational diversity too, which I think it's great. So my sincere personal thanks on that front. As already mentioned, my name is Carolina Adler. I worked at the Institute for Environmental Decisions at ETH in Zurich, originally from Australia, so that's probably why the accents come through. But I also have Chilean roots, so it's great for me to be back in Latin America and be amongst my colleagues here, so thank you for this opportunity. So the title of my presentation, it's probably slightly different to what you've got in your programs. So this is more a condensed version, if you like. But what I like to focus is on the way in which we assess adaptation research at the science policy interface, and in particular the epistemic standards that apply in that assessment process. So hopefully this will work, yes. So when I was first approached to come and give a talk under theme A on impacts, I realized that there's probably a lot of issues there to be dealt with, and most of them were in relation to different sectors, climate change impacts on different sectors, implications for adaptation, barriers and institutional issues. And I thought that's a great deal of information, very complex, great deal of information to be given in a single presentation. So having looked at the program and realizing that there's a great deal of variety and diversity in terms of presentations on those topics, I would like to just focus on the latter one, which is the institutional issues. So let me just begin by giving you an outline of what I would like to talk to you, and it comes down to three key topics. The first one is some very brief thoughts on the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, specifically Working Group 2 on impacts, vulnerability and adaptation. Second, I would like to share with you some recent findings from a review on topics and sources of disagreements or dissensus that arise when assessing evidence for policy. In this study, we focus specifically on the IPCC as a very useful and paradigmatic example to illustrate those disagreements and also try and make a case of why that matters. And finally, third, I'd like to conclude with just some thoughts and certain factors that we think present challenges for adaptation research going forward, especially as useful policy relevant knowledge. So let me begin with the first on the IPCC fifth assessment report, what now? While I haven't had the chance to read its report, the report in its entirety, it's been fascinating for me to follow on certain bits and pieces and follow some of the diverse discussions that have been taking place, especially in various fora. In particular, I concur with some opinions expressed that despite uncertainties in the attribution and future projections of climate change impacts, the central message has shifted from impacts alone towards a more pragmatic and outlook, one that takes into consideration other broader societal issues. So in other words, it's a rather problem-oriented orientation and a more society-relevant approach to adaptation. And the second encouraging message is that what Professor Karen O'Brien has mentioned recently in her blog, where the narrative of transformation in a changing climate is now entering the narrative of adaptation. And here O'Brien states, and I quote, the power of transformation lies precisely in its potential to raise political debates about what type of future is desired. So here is where values and worldviews that underlie each and every measure of adaptation matters a great deal. So a more contextual and pragmatic approach to adaptation that places normative consideration at its core, to me sound like very encouraging messages. And it'll be interesting to see how these framings play out in the policy process going forward. So now that we seem to be heading roughly in the right direction, what's next for the IPCC? And what can we expect to see in future assessments reports? Whether we appreciate this or not, the IPCC process has generated a fair bit of debate and considerable debate. So critically looking at the sources and reasons given for such disagreements, it warrants a closer examination if we are to pragmatically build on the achievements and support improvements going forward. So there are a number of good developments underway that seek to evaluate the state of the IPCC and future assessment reports. Two such developments that are quite pertinent to follow up on the one hand, a study proposed by social scientists to take a closer look at the internal deliberations of that process within the IPCC and how that influences the findings. So in other words, transparency is being looked at more closely. And on the other hand, we also have a series of comments from governments in response to the IPCC's invitation for them to provide their views on which topics and questions should be addressed with respect to the future of the IPCC. Consequently, the IPCC, in fact, agreed in its 37th session just last October to set up a task group consistent of member states to look at these considerations. So this is all great and really encouraging, but what else might be missing in that? So here I'd like to turn to my second topic, and that is assessing knowledge. And in particular, I'd like to share with you some results from a recent advanced review that has just been accepted for publication in Wire's Climate Change. And the theme addressed in this review centres on topics and sources of dissensus, or disagreements, as I mentioned, that arise as part of the IPCC assessment process. As I mentioned earlier, debate on the process is quite diverse and voluminous, particularly within the realms of social media and the blogosphere. Instead, for this review, we turned our attention to published peer-review literature, literature that outlines reasons for these disagreements, and gain some constructive insights for future improvements, precisely at a time when the IPCC itself is looking at an appraisal process of that. So we found that much disagreement regarding the assessment process can be attributed to metrics outlined in the guidance note, in particular, issued to authors in their assessment of evidence. The metrics, which no doubt is familiar to some, if not all of you, entail the likelihood and confidence scales here. So our sample constitutes 39 articles published between 2010, which is the year when the latest guidance, or the latest version of the guidance note was produced, and 2013. And we reviewed published literature within 3 distinct topics. And first is on procedure itself, how it's been applied. The second is on scope and diverse problems, epistemic approaches, and user perspectives within this scope. And the third one is purpose, of communicating clear, credible, and useful information for users. So we found numerous and diverse reasons for disagreements under each of these topics, which I only briefly summarize here in this table. But first, I think it is very important to note how these diverse topics and multiple sources of disagreements reflect the immensely challenging task that the IPCC seeks to tackle in a very manageable way. So it is important to give credit here to this very difficult task and acknowledge that steps are taken so far to address this. So when it comes to the application of the metrics in the guidance note here under procedure, Scholars question whether relevant results can be reliably classified within the proposed metrics. Inevitably, differences between experts' judgments and their biases in the deliberation process. With regards to scope, the articles reviewed argue that there are scientific approaches and problems to be covered by working groups that may not meet the conditions for meaningful application of the metrics. For instance, when informing on impacts or measures that strongly depend on case-based regional contexts. Others point out that the metrics are more favourable for the assessment of basic research rather than other forms of research like applied research, which are more case-specific in their nature. And finally, on purpose, disagreements are on whether or to which extent the metrics assist in constructing information that is relevant and clear to users. In the reviewed articles are put forward that question whether degrees of certainty are in fact clearly understood by users as information for taking decisions on policy. So we conclude that most of these arguments call for reconsideration of the intended impact of uncertainty communication and instead reframes the science policy interface as a joint task of adaptive governance, addressing relevance as a standard. So overall, we found that amongst the many reasons for this agreement presented, greater emphasis appears to be placed on issues relating to procedure and purpose, but not so much on scope. So for us, this signals that perhaps not much reflexivity is taking place on how we apply epistemic standards values in our research. And this leads me to my third and final point, which is about moving forward. And here I would like to focus on a couple of many challenges for adaptation research that we as a community need to address if we are to fulfill our aim of producing policy relevant knowledge and help solve societal problems that are conditioned by climate impacts. So two challenges that I think are quite important. One of them centres on the institutional drivers, and one of them happens to be Future Earth. And the second one is learning from case studies. Case studies is an inherent approach to adaptation research, and so we need to account for more appropriate standards for quality in that context. So let me begin with institutional drivers. One thing that Future Earth is really promoting is the call for more transdisciplinary approaches on co-designing research and co-producing knowledge in partnership with stakeholders. Here, transdisciplinarity is also understood as action research or more participatory approaches in research. So while this is a welcome development in our pursuit to tackle wicked problems, it also presents challenges for how we support such an endeavour, for instance, in assessing the quality of such knowledge when current standards may not adequately apply. By the way, some of you may find a case of déjà vu with regards to this, because only last week we were discussing this very question of quality in transdisciplinarity at a meeting in Sweden. So a special shout out to Lisa Dilling if you're in the room. Frank Beeman, the chairman of the Environmental Governance Project, he in fact made the very same call. So 3 of the 10 principles that Future Earth promotes that I see as being particularly relevant includes calls to, as I mentioned, promote scientific excellence, supporting science at the highest quality. Now, if we accept that we should aim for more transdisciplinary approaches in our research, then we should scrutinise which standards apply, in which manner they are understood, if we are to support that high quality transdisciplinarity. where standards relating to relevance go hand in hand with rigour in empirical findings. And rigour here may not necessarily relate to standards such as accuracy, replicability, precision, universality, and so on. It may be more about complexity, relevance, diversity, or others. So it is worthwhile thinking about how one would assess the quality of one's own transdisciplinary research and realise that these are quite implicit. I mean, just think about the peer review process and how that treats the transdisciplinary research. Is a rather inconsistent approach. Other key principles are to encourage co-design and co-production of agendas with various stakeholders. And last one, the bottom-up driven agendas. Again, these principles raise the importance of relevance as an adequate epistemic standard. This discussion on quality deserves greater scrutiny also in relation to case-based research. In particular, how to address synthesis and generalizable conclusions from a multitude of case studies for policy use. Again, this was also, I think, an issue brought up at the last climate adaptation conference in Tucson 2 years ago. But as far as I can tell, there hasn't been much research to give much substance on this. But I'll be very happy to listen and hear from anybody who has. As a core issue is whether one can infer that knowledge co-produced in a particular social and regional context is also applicable in another context. This is a critical issue for quality and transferability, given that inferences on the application of knowledge across cases is often done on implicit assumptions. So in philosophy of science, Cartwright in fact proposes evidence for use as a concept for how transdisciplinary research could be built upon. She elaborates on how to understand effectiveness in concrete situations, considering the answers, considering rather the structures of causal claims and the kind of evidence appropriate for use so that science answers the right questions in the right way. Such a structure could encompass components such as variability, diversity, and complexity in a problem and its context. He says that each case is unique when there are many factors taken into account. And this is an empirical finding that is consistent with the conjunction rule of probability. So there are no one best way, and nor are there best practices. There can only be better practices assessed according to those local circumstances. And here, according to local circumstances, throws a whole range of epistemic standards and criteria for quality that have many normative undertones beyond what is often considered in science as we know it. So, in summary, I just want to close with a wrap-up of the 3 points that I tried to bring across today. So the first one is that there are encouraging prospects for problem-oriented adaptation and impacts research, which I think are very worthwhile supporting. The second one is improving the assessment process itself. Transparency is one thing, but also differentiated instruments are needed to take into account diversity and complexity. And finally, it's about learning from case studies, and more so about the conditions for transferability in case-based approaches used in adaptation research. Thank you.
So I'm the silent presenter from the University of Pretoria, and I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who were also part of this work from Stellenbosch University, and I hope I can do them some credit. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to be a little bit brave and hopefully a little bit bold. I'd like to talk about conformation, transformation, and what else? And I want to use the disaster risk lens and also the climate change adaptation lens as my focal point. So we heard this morning from Chris Field that the latest assessment, particularly in ESREX and also in some of the other work in the fifth assessment, focused particularly on hazards, but it also moved into more of the vulnerability perspectives and obviously into adaptation. And I apologize for being a South African, but maybe because I'm close to 60, and can actually speak before Bruce Hurtson, so hopefully you won't mind some of these examples. But getting back to the hazards, these are examples taken from just outside Johannesburg. Two issues that I'd like to focus in on. This is the way we normally see this science. We look at flooding, and then we turn to drought, although drought is often more insidious and in fact often gets left off the agenda, quite frighteningly so, because floods tend to be more in our face. And we're here in the parts of the world, in Sao Paulo, where apparently the issue of the World Cup could be quite at risk in some ways because of the low reservoirs of the rivers feeding and moving into those reservoirs near Sao Paulo. In a country, by the way, this is from the Daily Telegraph, with the biggest supply of water in the world, but one of the biggest problems at the moment of water rationing. So where am I going with this? Well, in terms of those issues from the south, this is the paradigm that we normally use when we talk about disaster management and vulnerability. It builds on the work of Diana Carney and others from the development community and DFID. But essentially it has the double exposure kind of component. On the one hand, hazards and threats, like Chris Field showed us, but on the other hand, reduced capacity to cope and recover. And this is taken from Ben Wisner's work, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. So that's the given paradigm. And as Salim, I think, said this morning, perhaps the South can teach the North something. So I hope I can be a little bit subtle in my case studies. That's the paradigm. So are we conforming or confirming that paradigm? I'm going to use 3 case studies. The first is a case study from Southern Africa that we were involved in. So it wasn't South Africa. It was a 15-country study in SADC, which is the development community. And it was over 12 years, and it was funded or supported by FAO, and particularly as part of work for the Regional Interagency Standing Committee. And this is where I worked with colleagues from Stellenbosch. So what were we confirming? We confirm, and it's not really rocket science, I don't think. We've heard of multiple stresses, multiple stresses, multiple stresses. This is a case from Lesotho where you looked at the risk drivers on the one hand, which we examined, and then some of the resilience builders on the other. And it's quite an interesting diagram, and so you would say, well, so what? But I think this is where it became quite interesting when we were trying to do this study. Of the 47 humanitarian emergencies that we examined, 37 of those were linked to defined environmental threats, 26 were flood-related. But what came out of that picture was even more important, was that the urban issues, which we've already heard about this morning, and health issues, which I think Diana Liverman pointed to, are quite key. So what are we confirming? We're confirming a shifting agenda. We're confirming that the paradigm of risk and hazard is important. But what else are we confirming? And I'd like you to have a look at this slide quite carefully. These are the issues that emerged from our 12 study cases that we looked at over the 12 years from our 15 countries. And you see, maybe you can't see it from where you're sitting, but I'd like to draw your attention to the pink boxes, which are showing you the health incidents. So these are all cases that required humanitarian responses. So again, confirming a very multiple causation or multiple stressor dimension. What else can we confirm from the South, from Southern Africa? The spatial dimension is key, and I think it's an important shift because we tend to work on the local issues, but now we're starting to look at transboundary issues. And in this case, in this set of studies, this was Cyclone Eileen, which apparently was generated way out over the ocean, but had a phenomenal reach when it hit land and went all the way across to Namibia. Again, confirmation, nothing new. The temporal dimension was interesting, and this one I think was new from the South, that it's not a linear temporal sequence. And in the case of climate change, and even not even climate change, just climate variability, what we found in Madagascar was that these countries are facing 2 to 3 times a year a knock or a hazard or a shock or a stressor. And what it's doing in the South, in the global South, is compromising the prospects for recovery. So the temporal dimension, but with a little bit of a nuance of how that affects local capacity. If you look at the case of Malawi, really frightening. Of the 150 disasters that we picked up in terms of 2000 to 2012, 150 disasters, less than 10 resulted in international humanitarian assistance. So coming back to my theme of confirmation, we confirm that disasters are a big issue. But what's really interesting coming out from the South, and I think it's going to be picked up in this conference, is that the local communities often have to dig deep into their own pockets when international humanitarian assistance fails, or when the government rolls back or can't actually pay. So that's a confirmation, but with a bit of a nuance. My second case study, just moving along rather rapidly, and I hope I do justice to Anand Potwadin, who's sitting in the front. Please tell me if I don't. This is a case study from the Asia-Pacific region, and again, they looked at various cities and areas, Mumbai, Bangkok, Manila. And again, the findings were, yes, confirmation of what we as scientists kind of know already. Poverty is an issue, population's an issue, rapid infrastructure development's an issue, civic amenities is an issue. But again, the theme of the uninsured, where the local community are out of pocket because of the range of the stress. And I've looked through the program, and it seems that those of you working in Mexico, Brazil, and particularly those of us, I think, from the global south, this is an issue. So again, confirmation, adding a little bit of extra nuance. If we take the third case, and I hope my colleagues from South America correct me here, but La Red, the work of Omar Cardona and Alan Laval and others, again, nothing really earth-shattering in the sense of what we're confirming, but really looking at sustainable development issues, but more importantly, and this links to Provia, the issue of vulnerability reduction that he says must be an explicit objective of development planning. So, in terms of my first theme, how do we confirm or conform from the South? I think the studies that I've shown you conform what we know already. It's nothing new. But there are many exposures, there are multiple vulnerabilities, and this is the nub of my talk. This is my take-home message. No one person or no one group can do this alone. At the moment, we have the generation of kind of alpha, I think, scientists running around, creating large networks with big, grand challenges. And I would argue, and I'm not knocking these groups, but I think we need to be very, very careful that, in fact, there are insidious risks and insidious cases that require a multiple array of actors. So I would like to build on the previous speaker who was talking about transdisciplinarity. And I would like to move forward now in the next two sections of my talk about what this might look like. So the new buzzword on the block is transformation, and it's a very good word. It really means a change in systems of how you do things. And I'd like to pick up on what a number of people have been talking about, and that is the institutional architectures, the socio-political understanding, and the challenges. And I'm going to be a little bit bold. I personally feel, working in the areas that I've been working in for many years now, that our institutional architectures in some cases may be due for retirement and may need to be reinvented or hopefully replaced. Those institutional architectures, I think, are starting to have signals in various architectures, whether they be at the international level, in terms of the IPCC. Even though I've been part of the IPCC, I respect what goes on there, but I think the call for something different, in terms of the architectures for the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. But the second point is more important, the socio-political understanding and the political economy. And I see there is a session here on papers. I hope I've got it right, session number 39. Do our current architectures still fit, and are they appropriate? Whose agenda is being pushed? At what point do we actually criticize that and step back? So let me just take that second theme. Remember, the title of my talk is Confirmation. I showed you cases of confirmation, transformation. So without being too bold, some of you might know about this, and hopefully Provia knows about this. But in the Southern African region, I turn back to my backyard, if you like, we have done quite a lot of work in the region on vulnerability assessments. But it's not done by scientists. It's done by other practitioners. And this is the point I really want to make. Other practitioners are not stupid. They actually bring a range of tools and issues to the table. And what we've done in Southern Africa, I think, is transformative. And I'm sure there are cases in LARED and in other networks. We've set up a steering committee at the highest levels in SADC, and a regional vulnerability assessment committee. And then each member state buys in by contributing to a national vulnerability assessment committee. So you might say, well, what kind of science do they really do? I don't believe this. Well, these are people now, NGOs, others who've obviously been trained some time ago as scientists, but they've left that community and are now working in an NGO context. My point being that they can provide a wealth of knowledge in terms of this transformative agenda. I'm not sure if you can see the slide, but what they've used in this typology, if you like, of livestock and livelihoods in Botswana is to divide the households into various categories. They use an agroecological model, and you can see all I want you to focus in on is on the very poor and then the rich on the other side of the graph. If you have a look at the very poor, it's not, again, rocket science. When these communities are stressed, when they have a limited basket of goods, all they can do most of the time is to wait for a social transfer coming from government, or they can try and get into casual labor. But if you look on the other side, you can actually see that the better off, and again, it's not rocket science, we know this, but my point is it's coming from another audience. It's being validated by another community who isn't, I don't think, sitting in this room. Might not ever be invited back again. But anyway, I'm putting my neck out. So what you can see there on the right, on the other side, is the rich. They can sell their livestock. They can get into small business enterprises. I'm not going to dwell on this, but the summary from this architecture, a different kind of architecture, not a scientific group of architectures, but a bunch of people who've got together and have got legitimacy from the region and are starting to come up with some really interesting findings on vulnerability assessments, but that are not necessarily driven by scientists. So my question to us is, why do we invent the wheel when we've got people out there who are already doing this work, but they don't carry the badge of scientist, and then in a sense tend to get marginalized? So the last point in terms of transformation, what our study showed, and we've heard about it this morning from Gina and others, is that there's a changing context. There's new approaches, but I would argue there's also new nuances that are coming from the South. This is, again, the Southern African case. And what you can see there, it's not a brain surgeon's kind of finding that this region is on the move. Everyone is becoming, in a sense, moving towards urban areas for jobs, etc. But the nuance that's coming from the South in this case, which I don't think is coming from the North, although you could argue the point, is issues of xenophobia, human security, which are becoming huge challenges in terms of this vulnerability nuance. So there's another thing that I think the South could show the North and share with the North in putting those things firmly on the agenda with an evidence base which does not come only from scientists. And the last point in this section, before I conclude my talk, is that what we found in the Southern African region is that risks are being transferred across border areas. So this issue of transboundary issues is becoming critical. It's no longer local case-based research that matters. And in this case, in 2008 and 2009, the Southern African cholera outbreak spread dramatically through the region. Why? Because this population is not sedentary, it's on the move. And I'm sure it's the same in some cases in South America, Asia, etc. So as I conclude, my last little question mark, we've spoken about confirmation, we've spoken about some transformative issues, but what about innovation? And I'm sure we are all innovating. I think we can offer a lot of stuff in terms of drivers of change, particularly around thinking on urban and health themes. I don't know about the rest of you, but especially in the Africa chapters repeatedly and other countries in the IPCC, I think the health issues are really something that needs to be profiled very, very highly, but with a different lens. And hopefully I've given a few ideas that came from our area of the world. And then co-designing and co-learning for alternative futures. And I'm going to put my neck out once more. Certain groups, for example, like ICSU, and now I'm really putting my head on the block, their logo or byline is "We do science for society." And I can never understand that. It's not for society. Who are we? We are simply scientists who have one knowledge base. And I would argue, from my years of work, you need to be doing science with society. And that requires a different framing, a different way of doing things. But I must add, it's not easy to do, and that was raised already this morning. So what I've tried to show you in my talk is that there is a huge value that can be gained from other actors who are not sitting in this room. They're not the development aid agencies. I'm not talking about those kind of people, although they're very valuable. It's the practitioners, it's the citizens on the ground, the citizenship science that can play such a valuable role. And personally, I hope the word end user gets expunged from the literature, because there is no end user. We are all end users of one form and another. And it again implies this kind of we handing our knowledge on. There's a space for that, don't get me wrong. But I think we've kind of overutilized that quite a lot. So in conclusion, I've made this slide white because I really want you to take this home this evening when you're drinking your caipirinhas. It's not just science that is needed, but we need more focus on the process of science. And there's a gentleman I just recently met who was really fantastic in terms of some of his visioning, and I think he works with Salim. His name is Michel Pimbert. I hope I've pronounced it correctly, and I just want to read this quite carefully. He speaks in his article about cognitive justice, not about ecological justice, not about social justice, but cognitive justice. And I'd like to leave you with this thought. I think it's time in the Proveers and other groups that we should be thinking about these processes. Power equalizing research, ensuring greater cognitive justice between fundamentally different knowledge systems and ways of knowing. So I've tried to take science, I've tried to take you through a journey of practitioner input, not necessarily scientists, urging us to be a little bit more just in the way we mentally frame our approaches. So some final thoughts. I've tried to show that, honestly, I'm not saying we do the best science in the world, but I think we've got a lot to offer from the South. Confirming a lot of methods and methodologies, but thank God, not always conforming. Otherwise, why would you do science? You need that challenge. And I think there are some debates that we could have. I've also tried to show you and share with you some interesting areas where I think there is transformation already happening, not necessarily defined like you might define transformation, but for me, transformation nonetheless. And I also think there are spaces for innovation. But, and I really would like to leave this with you, much, much more is needed on transformational thinking. Not transformational science, which is, hopefully we do think when we do our science, although I'm not sure sometimes. Transformational thinking, the processes of how we do our science and with whom, the issue around cognitive justice. And I know Bruce Hewitson is most probably going to pick up on some of this today or tomorrow. So in conclusion, I'd just like to acknowledge again a team of scientists who I had the privilege of working with, not only from universities, but a huge team we got funding through the FAO. People were working in their countries, they were government officials, they provided us, they worked with us, they got the data. We didn't go and extract it from them. People like Omar Cardona, who's doing fantastic work on vulnerability, modeling and assessments, and then some of the other people whose work I drew on, people like Charles Rethman and Michel Pimbert. Thank you very much.
Yes, this is it. Great. Thanks, Antonio. Thank you, Jose, for inviting me to come talk about Hurricane Sandy. Thank you to Mark Stafford Smith, who actually got Bill Selecki and me to write this up for the special issue that he's been leading in Global Environmental Change. Some of the articles of that special issue are already up on the GEC website. The full set and the publication will be in a few months. So, of course, then I want to acknowledge my co-leader of the New York City panel on climate change, Bill Selecki, who is the social scientist of our duo, of our team, and of course all the members of the New York City panel on climate change. So this is really our take on the lesson, on some of the lessons learned, some of the things that we learned from going through the experience. So here they are. First, emerging findings show the importance of community groups in immediate disaster response. And, of the hundreds of events after Hurricane Sandy in New York, we were the only ones who invited Salim Huq to come and share with us the lessons from Bangladesh. And in fact, this is one of the lessons that you shared with us. And now, emerging findings from interviews from our social scientists are finding that happened after Hurricane Sandy. The second lesson is that Hurricane Sandy grounded, reinforced, and expanded the New York City flexible adaptation approach, which was in place before Hurricane Sandy occurred. The next is that the federal regulations balkanized the responses. I'm going to tell you the tale of 2 states and 1 city, New York, New Jersey, and New York City, and the different approaches that really followed from this federal balkanization, in part. And finally, a couple too on science, because I do still think the role of science is critically important. Federal, state, and municipal agencies are struggling to coordinate on the science across the scales and across the institutional telescoping scales. Very challenging. And finally, I do believe every city needs science in place and science in time. And then my way forward is Hurricane Sandy as tipping point. Okay, got to start with the science, the storm itself. Because, hey, what was Hurricane Sandy? It was a very unusual storm. It coincided with astronomically high tide. It was 1,000 miles across. The top slide compares Sandy on the left and Katrina on the right. There was a storm surge and a storm surge tide of over 14 feet down at the Battery. That's where the New York financial district is. And it also followed a very unusual storm track because it went up the coast and then instead of veering out to the Atlantic Ocean, it turned westward. So what did it cause? It caused the flooding that the storm surge caused. So first of all, it's important to know that Hurricane Sandy was greater than a 1 in 100 year event. It depends on which aspect of the storm for which actual number year event it was. But this is extremely important in terms of the way that the New York City, New York, and actually the United States organizes its risks and insurance, because our Federal Emergency Management Agency administration is all focused on the 1 in 100 year event. Now, there were outdated FEMA maps, which significantly underestimated the current risk level. So those maps in New York City were from 1983. So this mess, you can see of, here were the 1 in 100 year maps, here's where Hurricane Sandy absolutely went way beyond them. This had a very large effect on the risk perception. It changed dramatically caused by this event. Now, I'm not going to go over this, but this was the #1 frequently asked question from the media to our group was this climate change? So we spent a lot of time answering that no one storm can be attributed to climate change, but the sea level rise occurring over the past century in New York City, in part caused by thermal expansion, it did increase the extent. That is the actual direct linkage to climate change. Then we also have the potentially increasing North Atlantic hurricanes that some data show are on the rise. And of course, we have our polar vortex situation caused by the melting sea ice. That was like the year of the buzzword of the year, the polar vortex. What were the immediate preparations for Hurricane Sandy? New York City issued a mandatory evacuation from its Zone A on the 28th, as the day before. Out-of-state utility crews were brought in before the storm, and the MTA, and I do believe this is in part due to the work that we had been doing with them before, closed down operations. They moved their rolling stock, and New Jersey did not, to disastrous and expensive effect in New Jersey, and they boarded and placed sandbags there. So there were preparations immediately before, because the storm was well forecast, especially by the European models for the Europeans who are here. What were the impacts? these are, of course, only some of them. There were and I'm focusing on New York City, not the entire range of the storm, of which is multiple hundreds. In New York City, there were 44 deaths, 80% from drowning. There was major flooding of the seven subway lines under the East River. 3 tunnels were closed. 90,000 buildings were in the flood zone. About 2 million people. This is in New York City. This is there's about 8.5 million people in New York, just in the 5 boroughs. This is about a quarter of the population were without power. And all of Lower Manhattan was turned into a zombie zone in which there was no electricity, no power in the southern part of it. Was very eerie to be there. And altogether, $19 billion in damage. Now, there were unforeseen impacts. You know the surprises that we're always talking about? These were the surprises. That we didn't really think that there were going to be hospital evacuations when 6,500 people were evacuated. We didn't think that there were going to be, people didn't think that there would be gas shortages. There were the whole lines at the gas stations and people fighting to be sure that they had gas. And then there were also fires were also a surprise, particularly in some of the very small coastal communities. Breezy Point is one where they have sparked by perhaps connection of electricity and seawater, and the narrow streets in those communities hampered the emergency response. Those were the surprises. So turning to the lessons, first, this is the work of my colleague Malgosia Medjevich, who this is just a beginning set of interviews. She's planning a survey of 500. She wanted me to be sure to tell you it's not randomized yet. But what came up in these in this first set was that the decentralized community groups were far more effective than the big organizations of FEMA and Red Cross, and that clearly this needs to be recognized and worked on in this context of North America, I would say, following on Colleen's talk. The second lesson is about the flexible adaptation pathways. So with the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which had been convened before, and with the City Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability and the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, which are the managers of all the critical infrastructure across the entire infrastructure shed of New York, we had developed the concept of flexible adaptation pathways, framing climate change adaptation as a risk management issue. And this was the heuristic that was guiding the work. And Gary Yeo and Robin Lachenko were the authors of this chapter in the NPCC. So the blue wavy line is the acceptable level of societal risk. Blue is if we don't do anything, we just have status quo, we're going to cross. Even if we mitigate and only do one thing in terms of rigid adaptations, we're going to be on the orange line. If we only adapt, we're still going to, that's the yellow wavy line, we're still going to go above that level of risk. We're going to breach it. Finally, the green line, we have to both mitigate and adapt, and we have to be doing this repeatedly in a process through time in which we are monitoring and reassessing. So this was what was in place as the framing of adaptation before Hurricane Sandy. So what we've done now after Hurricane Sandy is gone back to that heuristic and put a lot more specifics on it. It's like, okay, what was really going on? So what we feel was, this is in the GEC paper, that you have to really be tracking what's going on with the acceptable level of societal risk, which in a way, I think almost ironically, the preparations, the few preparations that had been done were kind of saying, oh, well, now we're sort of ready, we're more ready. And then Hurricane Sandy came along and breached that. And so we then had a real plummeting of the acceptable level of societal risk, and then the yellow line is the very, very strong response to that change in the perception of risk that I spoke about early on. So now what happened, and here, this was the second most asked media question, was New York City prepared? So it was really hard to answer that question because the media kind of wanted us to say, no, they weren't prepared, they hadn't been doing anything, but they actually had. So I finally came to always answering this question that before Hurricane Sandy, the New York City leaders and governing structure, that was in low gear in preparing for climate risks. And after Hurricane Sandy, they moved into high gear. And these are in the special initiative on resilience and rebuilding that occurred after Hurricane Sandy. This is some of the portfolio of the multiple coastal interventions that are now in progress. So this is high gear. Here's the tale of the two states in one city. So Governor Cuomo of New York State, right away after Hurricane Sandy, he established the 2100 commissions. I was on one of them, and he recognized immediately climate change as increasing risks of extreme events. Governor Christie of New Jersey focused his efforts on rebuilding as was. And he, in his public statements, does not recognize climate change as increasing risk. Mayor Bloomberg, who was at the time the leader of the C40 Large Cities Climate Group, he created a $20 billion plan. He led the $20 billion Resiliency and Rebuilding Plan, which recognizes climate change as increasing the risks. What did the US Congress do? They required each of those entities to submit their own plans to receive the appropriated funds, therefore balkanizing any kind of regional response. And leading on to a word about scenarios, all levels of government, of course, rushed to the region. And including as we saw, we were just looking at municipal, state, and feds. And all the federal agencies also, they wanted to help. And so the federal agencies this is the NOAA have tools in their toolbox. That's a coastal mapping tool. But you know what? They have one approach for every single region. It's a little bit what we were discussing in the UCCRN session. So we had mega interaction process. I mean, this was hours and hours and hours of conference calls to tell them that the New York City Panel on Climate Change had done by far better sea level rise projections, taking all 6 factors, both global and local, into account, and that they needed to use ours. So thanks to colleagues, very insightful, great colleagues at NOAA, when you go on the national tool and you click on New York City, you actually see the local knowledge, echoing in part some of what Colleen was saying. So here's getting on to almost the end final lessons. One of them, why I do believe New York was able to respond to, I would say, and I hope I'm sharing with you and leading you to think so too, that New York really did work on responding in appropriate and effective ways. Why were they able to do it? Now, this is not the only reason, but one of the reasons is that the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and the first, it's actually the second National Climate Assessment in 2001, that's the green one, that's the very first one. We started that, Bill reminds me, we started that 15 years ago. And so we have a series of work that I think is also and by the way, on those teams in the MEC, we call it the MEC report, Metro East Coast report, on those teams we had the key stakeholders for each with us on our assessment teams. So we do that. This element of our work, I do believe, is very important, that we have science in place and science in time. So that, by the way, and this is the slide, I never, ever, ever would say, we told you so, but what this is showing is that all of the vulnerable, the hardest hit areas were in our reports from the very beginning, actually, from the very, very beginning. In the case studies, we had done case studies of those communities, many of them as well. And by the way, the overall findings from all of that work is what's in blue in the middle: interdependent critical infrastructure systems and vulnerable communities. And that is what cities are, I think, almost, pretty much everywhere. So right after the hurricane, Mayor Bloomberg, literally, not himself, but his emissary called us up, and he reconvened the New York City panel on climate change to provide updated climate risk information for the rebuilding planning. That was actually the link, the handshake to the congressional appropriations. And my point is that if we hadn't been doing all of this, we wouldn't have been ready to do this. You couldn't ever start right after a disaster to really start, we need climate projections. I mean, how could, it would take years. So that we had done it before, we reconvened our group, with people, we bring in people that we need. For example, this new work for the first time is including both a combination of storm surge modeling and sea level rise. So we're going beyond the bathtub approach, which for those of you who do this kind of work, it's actually very exciting. So we night and day, science in real time, 24/7. In 2013, we created new climate change projection for use in the rebuilding. That's the Climate Risk Information 2013. And then all of the city managers, they created this enormous task force to create the Stronger, More Resilient New York plan. And I just put, because of the, it's a fun definition of resilience. You know how we're always into definitions, transformation, adaptation, things like that. Anyway, so you see the synonym for New York City for resilient is tough. So now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything was all wonderful and there were never any points of dissension. So I want to just share with you the two main points of difference. And this is not just since Hurricane Sandy. This has really been over the storm surge barrier discussion has been going on for a very long time, and I know we have Dutch colleagues here who have been part of this and have come to New York and really shared their expertise on this. There's been one group, there's one, I would say, way of thinking that really storm surge barriers like the Thames Barrier or what Venice is doing is the way to go, because it's a long-term, large area facility, it deals with the increasing risk, it does a lot, it really protects a lot. But then the folks who are more on the drawback side say it's very expensive, it's only partial area. Role of high winds and inland flooding is also very important when these storms come through. Environmental impacts and what are the environmental impacts and what are the social issues if you're only protecting some of your city's population and not others. On the buyout side, this came up after Sandy, and this was actually a difference that came up between the leadership of New York City and the New York State. So New York State, Governor Cuomo put forward a buyout program, which we in our jargon would call retreat. And the leadership of New York City, as you can see from that definition of resilience that I just showed on the previous slide, they really didn't want to hear anything about anything that would be sort of indicating kind of defeat, because for New York and for New York City, the image of New York as a vibrant coastal city is so important to the whole working and the gestalt of the city. So these are some very interesting. But there has been the New York State, there has been one or two communities that actually has, and this is on Staten Island, which was the hardest hit. Okay, last slide is the way forward. So you know how in climate science we're always talking about tipping points, with the melting of the glaciers and the melting of the ice sheets, et cetera. What Bill and I put forward in the paper is that we do feel that Hurricane Sandy is a tipping point. that, as I showed, the acceptable level of risk plummeted. Investment and action were mobilized by New York City. The New York report on that special initiative on resiliency and rebuilding, U.S. congressional appropriations, and I don't have time to talk about the Rebuild by Design program, which is led by Henk Ovink from the Netherlands. They're creating what we don't want to go all the way to say transformation, but we do feel that a transformative new development trajectory is now begun in the New York region. Very importantly, for the United States, there is now explicit recognition of increasing climate risks due to climate change. This has taken decades. I'm looking at Chris, who I'm sure will agree. This has taken decades in the United States. It is now, and I think, and the National Climate Assessment that Diana presented this morning is also a big part of this too, now thoroughly accepted in public discourse. This is a very large change. The major effect, we think it had a major effect on the coastal storm protection planning, not only in New York City, but maybe because we're New Yorkers, we think it does affect other places in New York State and nationally, and perhaps even internationally. The factors are leadership with Mayor Bloomberg, and especially Mayor Bloomberg, he's now, Secretary General's special envoy on climate change in cities. There was federal, state, and municipal alignment for the very first time. And also New York as a media hub, these are some of the factors. Of course, the challenge is to sustain that trajectory. And so people are asking me, because Mayor Bloomberg is now no longer the mayor of New York City, now Mayor de Blasio, but I can now report, I can say that he is reconvening the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and this time with an emphasis on his special interest, which is the emphasis on equity issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia.
So this is a bit of a change of pace, not least of which because I cannot in no ways match Cynthia's enthusiasm and physical vigor. So she's like Mozart, I'm like Wagner. So I'm also a change of pace because I'm a physical climate scientist. I'm not in the adaptation community, although I work with adaptation projects a lot. And I'm here by accident because I happened to see the program, and I wasn't going to be coming to the meeting, and I commented that I think there's a big gap in the program. And of course, I then got asked to come and do a talk about what I consider the gap in the program. So I've used this cartoon on just about every talk that I've given this year so far. And if you can't read it from the back, it says, and over there we have the labyrinth guards, guarding the labyrinth of climate information. One always lies, one always tells the truth, and one stabs people who ask tricky questions. And I want to pose some tricky questions to you, so please don't stab me too much. How much do you know about the climate information products that you use? And here's a scenario for you. You've just been awarded $1.2 million by a major international development agency to look at adaptation options for coastal cities in Africa. You go to your favorite climate research group. They have their favorite data product on the shelf. They pass it over to you. You hire a postdoc quickly to analyze it for you. You turn it into a whole lot of scenarios that you pass on to the agency, and that informs their investment in adaptation. And then you discover there's another product on the shelves in another organization that gives you a different answer. Now, who carries the responsibility for that situation? Because that situation is happening over and over again, in developing nations especially. So that's what I want to talk about, largely coming out of my position in the World Climate Research Program, where this is a strong emerging issue that we're trying to wrestle with. So some realities from the current world outside there. Typically, if you generalize, we have average information for the average user. That face over there is National Geographic's attempt to try and look at what is the average face in the world, and they amalgamate all the different ethnicities and they get the average face. Of course, there is no average user, there is no user, following our colleague's comment, but we still use the term. And unfortunately, the climate science community tends to give average information. And because there's no average user, the average information doesn't really meet the bill. The Global Framework for Climate Services has this statement that we're talking about the management of risks of climate variability through science-based climate information and prediction for planning, policy, and practice. That's a lovely objective. It almost sounds as if we can do that already. And then another organization, which I've hidden the name of because some people might object, they had this statement: climate science is now at the stage where it can provide global services to meet the adaptation needs of government, businesses, and public at regional and local levels. If that doesn't make you shiver, it probably should. So, what do we do about this? What is the issue really here? The context of the physical climate scientist is largely motivated through exploration. If you want to be cynical, it's motivated by publication. The output of the climate science community, the physical climate science community, is poorly connected to what I would call the time imperative of real perceived needs by the IB communities and other societal systems. But if you look at the context of the information adoptee, and note I'm not using the word the user, there's increasing portal proliferation. It's all over the place. You can go and find a dozen different portals that will give you data, but the data will contradict each other quite often. There's a growing self-authorized community of purveyors of this information, so-called interface or boundary organizations, including full commercial services. And you know when you buy something, you've got to use it. There's also the establishing of perhaps competing, but certainly influential, top-down initiatives, both global and regional. I know I've certainly come under pressure in our country to get a national consensus message on climate change. What is X for 2050? And I'm fighting that as hard as I can because there is no consensus message. And the accelerating uptake of data as information. Increasingly, we're seeing adaptation actions where they take the data, treat it as information, and apply it into a context which has real-world consequences. And not even talking about responsibility and accountability in that, which I am actually going to talk about tomorrow. So, what is the problem here? We have the past, we have the future, we have observations of the past, which are probabilistic, because we don't know exactly what happened. The data sets are erroneous, the different observational data sets are sometimes contradictory. We have a fair amount of physical understanding of the processes and dynamics of climate change forcing on the global system, what's happening to the high-pressure systems, frontal systems, and so on. And we have this range of GCMs, the CMIP5 GCM archive, which is the whole atlas for in Working Group 1 of IPCC. And we have some downscaling of that with the regional climate models, but it's sparse. Not every GCM is downscaled, not every RCM is involved. And then we have statistical downscaling, which has the same sort of problem. And these are all self-contradictory. I could take you to different GCM and find a different RCM, a different statistical downscaling, and a different observational data set, and you would say, what the hell's going on here? So we have a fundamental problem there, where the contradiction is not system uncertainty. It's not the physical climate system's uncertainty, but it's uncertainty from structural issues of the tools, from the scientific error, it's from limits of understanding, but it's also uncertainty from choice in what you've chosen to use. And choice is, I think, probably one of the biggest elephants in the room. Excuse the pun for those who know my elephant story. And choice is a major source of uncertainty. And the adaptation community really needs to recognize the introduction of uncertainty by the choices that are being made. Here's one online example. There's a website, which I've hidden behind a tiny URL link over there. You can go and look it up if you really want to. But it's not about institutions, because this is one example of many portals out there that do exactly the same. The title is Fine-Scale Climate Projections for Africa. And they give a flow chart, a flow diagram there of how they achieve the projections. The details are not important. Let me point out that they've made a choice of 8 GCMs and 2 emission scenarios. Well, okay, I could live with that, but there are another dozen or 2 GCMs you could look at as well. How are you choosing your GCMs? Then they make a choice to do dynamical downscaling, which again is fine, there's nothing wrong with that, but which RCMs are you going to use? How are you going to couple them to the GCMs? And they make a choice about then applying the output from the RCMs, which are biased. They apply a bias correction procedure, do a change factor downscaling, and then they spline interpolate this to 30 arcsecond resolution. Now you have to ask the question, what is the information content of that 30 arcsecond product at the end of the day? I could change any one of those choices in the chain and give you a completely different answer. The problem is when we look at a data set, we do pattern matching. Our brains are incredible pattern matchers. So here's an example of pattern matching. Can you look at those marks on the screen without reading the words? It's almost impossible. I've tried again and again. look at those lines as lines, not as words. But we look at them and we see words, because our brain is so strongly stimulated by the patterns. Here's another example. My father was a surgeon, and whenever you read his writing, you just couldn't read it. But after a while, you get used to it. And so that sentence says, this is a prescription. And it's scrawled, and you know what doctors' writing is like, but we see patterns so easily. And here is nonsense. But we want to make aquapove, a word out of it. We want to make a word out of it because our minds are inclined to find a pattern even when there isn't a pattern there. And this affects our choices and interpretation of the choices that we make. So here's an example of how I think this might play out. Some data sources are amenable to exploring and searching for those patterns as real patterns. Others are not so, but we'll find the patterns nonetheless. If you think of, on the X scale there, the increase in information detail, such as increasing our spatial resolution, examining sub-annual resolutions, adding different variables, and so on. And on the Y-axis is the change of the decision consequence. How your decision consequence will change subject to the resolution and detail of information you got. And you could do one thing like this. This could be a GCM product. With a GCM, you'll reach the limit of the information content quite soon because it's low resolution. You can get a lot of precision out of a GCM. You can go right down to the 10-minute resolution data in there, but that's not information. So initially, your decision consequences will change right rapidly until you reach the limit of the GCM. But there are other data sets out there, and they might have completely different curves, different ways, different consequences, depending on what the data says about how much you can interpret it out of it. And then, of course, there's a limit where they will all plateau, and there's diminishing returns on the effort expended to analyze the data set. Unfortunately, if you take the red curve as the GCM curve, a lot of people are working way out on the tail of the right-hand side, way beyond the limits of what the information content actually is. So you could, for example, choose a GCM product and compare it to the downscaling product. Say it's the brown curve or the red curve. And you begin with regional time and space averages. IPCCs, lovely. IPCC's got the latest product. Say you've got a project to go and do water resource management in the city of Cape Town, to take a home location. And you go to the IPCC, it's the latest and greatest, it must be the best. And you'll get 6 monthly averages, so 2 6-month seasons for each year, and you'll get the median, and you'll get the 20th and the 80th percentile ranges of the GCMs. And you'll exhaust the information content of that very quickly, but you'll end up with an outcome, and you say, well, on the basis of this would be the decision of an adaptation process on water resource management for the city. Or you could go to the World Climate Research Program's Cortex program, where you get multiple downscalings. It'll take a long time to exhaust what the information content of that is, but you can go a lot further with it. And your decisions will change quite dramatically. We've tested this. Layer on more information, and the trajectory of the decision makes rapid and sudden changes with very dramatic consequences. And so at the end of the day, your choice of data set may lead you to 2 decision outcomes which could be fundamentally different. One of them will be maladaptation. Who carries the responsibility of this? Here's one example from a paper we published at the end of last year. One very simple choice. So we did a statistical downscaling with GCMs, and the only thing we changed was the observational data set used to calibrate the statistical downscaling. We took 2 observational data sets, used it to calibrate the statistical downscaling, and there are regions on the map where the sign has changed, let alone the magnitude. And that is simply the choice of observational data set to calibrate the downscaling. That's a scary outcome, because these data sets get picked up and adopted and used very quickly. So the one end of the spectrum is go to the GCMs. This is from the IPCC report. You go to the atlas, you get these sort of figures, and you look at across Central Africa, and the message is, it's going to get wetter or drier. And it's really hard to say anything more than that, which is not much use. Then you go to, well, let's go to regional downscaling. Let's go to the regional climate models in the WCRP's Cortex program. And then you find these 2 models in the center of the page there, where the soil moisture across Central Africa is completely opposite. So what do you do with that? And if you look at the ensemble average, which is the upper red box there, the ensemble average is just sort of merging of those 2s. And if you use the ensemble average, what are you actually responding to when you develop your actions? Here's another example. This is statistical downscaling for Arusha in Africa, and you could look at there, the grey bars are the climatology of rainfall on each month, the blue and the red are the positive anomalies or negative anomalies for future climate change. And you could see sub-annual periods where you can maybe see consensus, you can see some areas where there's no consensus. But you go to another location and you get this. You get these outlier models. And until you go and explore the data, you don't know there's an outlier model, and that skews the range substantially. So what if you mix up the methods? Let's take the GCMs and the RCMs and the statistical downscaling. Well, this is an attempt, and don't worry about the details, but the green is all statistical downscaling. The blue is a stretch grid global climate model doing downscaling from the SEMA 5 models. And the blue curve is a Monte Carlo approach to generating the probabilistic changes of rainfall. And it's really hard, again, to say, what do you take away from it? We don't know how to treat these different products. They're very fundamentally different, and yet they're all trying to give the same message. This one really scared me. This is dry spell duration, downscaled in different ways for a particular location. These are the anomalies of dry spell duration. And dry spell duration for agriculture can be a critical factor. And you can say, well, okay, there looks like there's sort of some consensus of change of a reduction in dry spell duration on these 2 shoulder seasons. Fair enough. But then you go and add in 3 more GCMs and you get that. Now what do you do with that? Maybe you took 2 of those GCMs and you got a common result and you promulgated that through a whole adaptation action. Again, where's the responsibility for that line? So the challenge is, how do we parse the data? Parse is a nice computer science term of how do you break up the sentence? How do you distill out of it? Now, when you engage with face-to-face interaction, you can do this. So we've had a number of face-to-face interactions over the number of years now. Last year, the best one was with 5 African cities. And we spent a week face-to-face, climate scientists, city managers. We worked together on the issue. And we could say, well, that's rubbish, this is relevant, this is data, that's information. And we could come to some conclusions. But we can't do face-to-face with everybody. We know that. Not everybody has a tame climatologist in the back pocket who knows the range of conceptual issues. So we have this enormous capacity deficit for face-to-face interaction. How do we facilitate? I'm going to use the word users, I'm sorry. How do we facilitate this community that needs to be informed by the climate information in a way that they can do it responsibly without leading down maladaptation avenues? So this is where we get the distillery. We need a distillery, not to produce what you particularly might want, but think about what a distillery does. It takes impure material, distills it into something pure. Now remember, a distillery can produce poison as much as it can produce purity, healthy stuff. So the 3 examples put up there. Water, we would like to give life-giving water out of this distillery. We could produce vodka, which is very nice to drink, has long-term consequences. And in South Africa, we have something called Witblits, which is you drink it by the thimbleful, any more than that, and you have a transformative experience. So our argument is we need a distillery. How do we distill this to a message that can actually be responsibly adopted? And I challenge you to think of actions you've done where you've used a single stream of climate information. What are the consequences of the activity if you had chosen a different climate stream of information? The idea of a distillery is you distill it, you add your favorite mix of non-climatic stressors and drivers, you serve in the context of risk management decision making. Unfortunately, there is no product on the shelf out there that is the product of a distillery. We don't have our best whiskey distilled in the bottle on the shelf ready to buy. So we are following an avenue quite strongly on this, where we need to look at the observations of the past, the process understanding, the GCM predictions, and the downscale predictions, and we need to bring those together into, firstly, storylines that are physically consistent with our understanding of the dynamics of the climate system. And secondly, then, data products of articulated uncertainty. But particularly the storylines. You can do a lot with a storyline, as you know. So where is this going? What's coming in? What's needed? First thing that I think is probably a very important step, so the World Climate Research Programme's Working Group on Regional Climate, which I'm part of, is holding an expert meeting on distillation. We've got to find a better term for it. I don't think the fundings will like that label, but we'll find an alternative to a distillery. But we're having a distillery meeting later on this year to try and grapple with this, because in 20 years we have not made much advance. IPCC is still using model democracy, one model, one vote. There is a slow but growing awareness amongst the downscaling community, at least, that this is a major problem, that we are informing the adaptation community with inherently self-contradictory data sometimes. And we need to wrestle with this issue and find out what we can responsibly deliver. Thirdly, I think there's a huge need for a forum where these communities can engage around these issues, because the distillery needs to be informed by those people who are operating in the decision-making world. And I take Colin's point, those are not always the adaptation scientists. So, for example, I go back to my experience last year where we had 5 African cities. It was the city managers who were informing us about how we distilled information. And they were far more useful, far more valuable in helping us do that than perhaps some of the professionals. And then lastly, with apologies, 2 postdoc announcements at UCT if you're interested in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Could you just go back? May I ask the 4 speakers to come to the table? We have time for maybe 2 questions, 10 minutes. And
Good evening. My name is Balqis Osman Al-Asha. I am a member of the Science Committee of the Provia. Thanks for very interesting presentations. My first question to Caroline. You mentioned the IPCC guidance note. I couldn't understand what do you mean by guidance note. Is it the IPCC reports or another guidance note? And for Colin, I couldn't get if you are with or against the SADC assessment by practitioners. You mentioned it is needed, they have a wealth of information and everything, but then you seem to have some reservations, which I couldn't get. If you can just explain. Thank you.
thank you. Would you like to comment?
If I understood correctly, because unfortunately with the air conditioning it was hard to hear, but I think the question was where did the guidance note come from, right? Or what was used by authors to guide their assessment process?
The analysis of the IPCC guidance note, the analysis you presented.
Yes.
Yeah, so what is IPCC guidance note? Which one? Is it the IPCC reports, or what do you mean by IPCC guidance note?
Oh, right, yes, it's the uncertainty guidance, I'm sorry. Yeah. So this is the guidance that was issued to authors to facilitate the way in which evidence is assessed for uncertainty communication, so communicating uncertainty. So that was the basis of the analysis, and a lot of the papers that we looked at were not necessarily looking at uncertainty in isolation. They were specifically looking at the guidance note as a source of uncertainty, and they had diverse reasons for that. But it really comes down to the guidance note, the one issued to authors as part of the IPCC process.
Thanks, Balqis. I didn't mean to imply that the vulnerability assessment committees are necessarily the correct answer. But I think if Provia, I don't know if they've been using that data, but one of the issues is how do we make that data credible? That it's at the moment in the grey literature. So maybe that's why I was asking the question at lunchtime. Is there a way we could engage with Provia to find a credible way of taking that huge amount of information and seeing to what extent we could feed it either up into science assessments or downwards? So I wouldn't like to say it's great. I don't think it is fantastic at the moment, but it's a huge data set that's just waiting to be assessed and examined. And I'm sure the scientists and the NGOs and the different humanitarian agencies, they're using that data to make food delivery and food interventions. And I'm sure if one entered into some negotiation, we could work on that. So I'm kind of sitting in the middle a bit at the moment, because obviously for scientists you would need, especially if it was going to go into the IPCC, you'd need to find some credible process.
Thank you, Colin. We have time for another question. I have to choose. Yes, please.
Thanks. They were all great presentations. My question or comment goes to Bruce. Very nice talk. You showed many slides where there were some squiggly lines with a few GCMs, and then added some more, and the squiggly lines went somewhere else. I think the take-home message there is we have to move to including some sense of uncertainty in these lines. Even that range, no matter how many GCMs you add, isn't the full set of uncertainty, as you know. So this distillation idea, this storyline, is really good one. And I just want to give you one story from my. Just last year, I was at the UNEP's governing council, and I was approached by a minister of an Arabian country. Had money, wanted a UNEP adaptation project, and I started to talk to him about what we could deliver. And they said, no. What I want is a downscaled GCM model coupled to hydrology model. Well, this was a minister, so obviously somebody had told him that he wants this. And he was falling into exactly the trap that you've just described, yet it was a very strong political push for us to deliver what was being asked for. So I think both on a technical side, ensuring that the modeling community does this kind of work to better understand uncertainty, and that downscaling may give you numbers on the right horizontal scale for adaptation concerns, but not necessarily better value added to the information on that scale. And then to deal with this other end of the spectrum, which is the desires that we see coming from all kinds of political level people for what they feel they want as part of their adaptation strategy.
It's a great story, and I'll just make one comment. The most frequently asked question I get is, which is the best model?
Yeah, we take a last question very quickly, please. Here.
Right, okay, thanks very much, Hartwig Kramer again. The question goes namely to Colleen. UNEP is changing the way of doing business, particularly in assessments, and bringing communities of practice which are outside the traditional scientific community to inform regional assessments about, well, also adaptation, but predominantly the state of the environment in the context of social environmental system changes. What would you think would be the way forward with dealing with what you just told us? I mean, can we bring these communities of practice into this process in our regional assessments? Are the data they are producing open, accessible, through and featurable, for instance, through a platform like UNEP Live, which makes them immediately visible on a global scale? Those are things which we've been asked to explore. And in the last open-ended CPR we had in Nairobi, we had actually 52 countries voluntarily signing off for making their data openly accessible. And the other example we have here in Brazil, where actually the National Water Association has made their data openly accessible for the next United Nations Environmental Assembly through UNEP Live. But I think bridging beyond or going beyond these classical traditional communities that build assessments is a very critical moment, and also tapping on information in grey literature. It's an ongoing debate, it's a discussion, it's currently happening, so that's the time to engage now. And so it's my question, would you think that would work?
Can I address that offline? Because I think it's a huge question. And it's context specific, it's regionally specific, and it's who's involved and what the politics is. So I'll chat to you offline.
Thank you very much.